Hi, today I am really excited to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is showing the impact of design. A little bit about me. My name is Jessa. I am the head of strategy research and systems for auto finance at Capital One. And today I'm presenting a topic on behalf of our field, not on behalf of any company, because I want to contribute to a subject that I hope impacts both research and design. So, what are we going to learn? Well, hopefully, we're going to learn that data and design have an undeniable future together, and that automation of measuring quality really needs to be a part of it. We're going to learn that you can measure design quality in an objective, quantifiable way, but it's hard, it is doable. And that design leaders have a responsibility to influence the data that is being built in a product lifecycle, not just any data, design data. So, why does this feel important? There are many reasons, but I'm going to hit on three here. One is that measuring quality is extremely hard. It is going to demand that new types of talent join the ranks of a design team. Design data engineers, analysts, insight developers, these are potentially new roles that will fill our systems. Two, technology is only going to get more complex. And how we connect and include design systems and tools really becomes a vital part of this ecosystem. And then three, this is important because design digitizes faster than we can measure it. And design's value is in the creativity it unlocks. It's what makes our roles vital. But measuring takes time. It takes definition, integration, it takes forethought. And a lot of this can be an afterthought, which leaves leaders scrambling to find an ROI or using sales data or just marketing data or something that is a proxy when we really know that the impact of our team is so much bigger. So, the key takeaways that I hope you'll get in this talk is that there's a difference between the subjective and objective means of measuring quality. And we often over-index on subjective because it's so related to traditional forms of user experience. But we can apply a formulaic framework to help us identify low-hanging fruit that might already exist. We just have to find it. And that influencing development process with the right type of experience data gets easier when design leaders learn new skills. And I do mean measuring math and qualitative skills. So you're probably thinking at this point, but we do track data. We have product data, we have downtime, code reviews, I have sales, I have marketing, I have all kinds of algorithms, and that's great. But that's not what I'm talking about. And that's not what I'm focusing about today, because we probably don't track design data with the same type of rigor. And what I'm talking about is design data in the context of a user interacting with a system, the quality in use, specifically crafting a view that will tell us whether or not the design and experience of quality as a byproduct of a user's interacting with the system as a whole is telling us what we need to know. Because if the data we had today were enough, this would be a very weird topic for me to give at a conference. If what we had today were enough, our design budgets would be much bigger. Our design teams wouldn't keep fighting for headcount. We would have engineers and analysts as a standard within our teams. And design leadership at the highest level of an organization would be the standard. So clearly, there is still an opportunity here for us in design. What's the problem? Let's define it a bit. Organizations are often hard-pressed to find metrics, but they often chase things that are irrelevant to the user experience, or they might have a proxy catch-all metric. NPS is a perfect example. It's easy, it relates to design, it can be quantified, but companies will often stop here when we know that experience is so much more. Many UX professionals that work in healthcare fields, data-rich fields, or just natural science, they will be hard-pressed to build buy-in, to conduct even small studies. And then it's often hard to build credibility on the recommendations from just evaluative findings. And even if there are a few metrics around usability, usually within companies, there's no systematic place to track them. Not like we track code, not like we track downtime, not like we track sales data. The cost is that device telemetry and device instrumentation will lack design specific data standards as part of a requirements patrick. We miss out on getting in the ground floor of a development process, down to the very UI tagging that needs to happen in the code for us to view. And the consequences are bigger than you might think. It's expensive. Gathering design metrics impacts measurements, but it's often reactionary after a product has launched. And this leads to reactive decision making. So even if a design leader does prove the value with a leader, with their VP, with a team, the minute you have a leadership change, you have to reprove that all over again, reform those relationships, and reforge that understanding. In a reactionary state, you never have enough researchers, you will never have enough designers, and your budget for really studying the user issues will have to be saved for quote unquote truly important insights. And this is expensive because it leads to gaps in understanding our users. And design leaders, your product and engineering partners can be your strongest allies when it comes to things like this. But we have to know how to articulate what we're needing from their systems. And often, usability methods then become inaccessible to our partners, or they seem like it's done in the dark or part of an elite practice, but it's not. It shouldn't be. It should be universal. It should be understood and accessible. And finally, it creates burnout. When means of measuring are not well integrated into the software engineering practice, when they're not released with every code, it means that tool support is limited for your design teams, and it's expensive to integrate. So researchers and designers will find themselves constantly reproving the same point with different teams, or maybe the same team. The effort of measuring usability might gather dust in some PowerPoint presentation, and sooner or later, that team member decides that they want to go solve a new problem because they can never be done with this problem. And this leads to attrition. It leads to apathy. It leads to burnout. We want to solve new things. But even objective measures have challenges. I'm going to touch on a few here. There are more, but I'm going to touch on a few. One is that there are a few guidelines or standardized models of the definition and usage of usability metrics that developers can apply consistently. So it's hard for design leaders, designers, and researchers to really articulate the systems that respond to it. Most framework is missing design-centric data requirements, and it's not well integrated into the development practice. And I don't know about you, but I didn't become a designer because I loved math and data. And in fact, I chose the creative field because I failed algebra twice. But this is a new frontier. This is something that is evolving in our practice, and we have a responsibility to know more than just what we think. And while we may have not gotten into this field because of math and because we love science and calculations, it is in our future. Once upon a time, there was just a graphic design role and maybe a technical architect. But today, as a designer, you have a different role to play. To be an effective designer, you need to acknowledge that you have a responsibility to know the data that is in your systems, in your devices, and in your services, not to the depth of a data scientist, but so that you can understand how to build from it. This is hard. Measuring quality as a context of the design experience is probably not on top of every leader's list, but I can tell you this. The reason it is important is because we need to be part of an evolution of practice. A designer's role has grown, and we need to be part of it. As humans, we want to measure things because we want to express and verbalize the importance of our experience. Because when you can measure what you're speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. But when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, it may be the beginning of knowledge, but you have scarcely advanced to the stage of science. So in this next section, I want to touch on humanizing what's probably been elusive, which is a framework of design quality. And what I hope it inspires is that how you might see a systematic approach for breaking down this complexity, forming allies with your product partners, and challenging your company to express, with numbers, the impact of design. Let's dig in. When it comes to knowing what to measure, quality is not one thing. It is nuanced. There's a difference between subjective and objective measures of quality, but both can be measured with similar design category lenses. For the purpose of the talk today, I want to focus on usability. I want to focus on looking at objective ways that we can push standardization, instrumentation, and measuring at the product development level, thus freeing up ourselves and our teams to take out the complexities of the subjective space. To do this, we can decompose usability into three factors. Three things: factors, criteria, and metrics. So first, we need to determine the factors that make up design quality. And we're familiar with the big three, right? Efficiency, effectiveness, and satisfaction. But over the years, more have come into the scene. These include things like safety, something being useful, learnable, accessible. How we measure this field is ripe for disruption. Many of these have ample room for testing, for finding new metrics, and for determining how we might pull these into our practice. So, taking each factor, the next thing to do is to break it down into its criteria. For example, what is efficiency actually made of? When you're measuring efficiency, you're measuring something like time. You're seeing if it has good navigation, if it has great use of resources. When things are efficient, they make sure that the user knows how to use it. If you want something to be learnable, for example, a learnable experience is familiar, it is consistent, it is simple, and it provides user guidance. And I'm hoping that you're seeing how we can use our design systems in this. Because the next thing we want to do is break down and identify the criteria that encompasses each of these. So if you want something to be learnable, you are looking at user guidance. Things like hint text, microcopy, or minimal actions become not just design screens, but they become components you measure in order to understand if something is learnable to your user. So this second layer, this criterion, it describes concrete, measurable indicators. Definition of this is key because each subset of criteria requires clear understanding of what it is and what it is not just for your design team, but for your product and tech team as well. Let's take understandable as an example. In my definition here, I am saying it means how capable the product can convey its purpose and give clear user assistance. I'm not measuring evaluative understandability. But what this means is that we can use our design system. What help text do we have? Do our components have the right microcopy? Can we measure how many times someone has clicked on a help link? These can be quantitative measures that are built into the product itself, defined by the user analytics that are tracked. And this immediately draws a distinction between a qualitative state of something being understandable, where the user says, yes, I know what this means. And it becomes a back-end indicator, a benchmark that signals a problem before your researchers dive in. As you've defined the criteria and the subset, you can see at a glance the product characteristics that become important to how you approach or control how the interface is actually evaluated. You can identify the overlapping areas. Which criteria can be used in multiple ways? Now, what I'm showing you here is these are just some of the outlines. Breaking down all 10 categories creates a matrix of about 100 plus combinations, but the idea is the same. Systematically identify the criteria within, because the next step is where it gets fun. I mean, if you think data is fun, because criteria like time or learning or productivity, they're made up of something. They're not just random things. They don't just exist in an ethos or a qualitative state. What goes from being an abstract concept can become a logical sequence of operations that are used to quantify a quality attribute. Because the next thing you do is you go find the numeric value because it exists somewhere. It might be countable data, it might be a metric, but here's an example. Minimal action, which is part of efficiency, is made up of things like time on task, completion rate, or even just the number of commands that were used. If you're measuring something like time is something we can measure through things like throughput, time-based efficiency, or even completion rate. They have numeric values. When you find the definitions, those definitions have actual literal math behind them. Using our example of time, here's a breakout, a small sample of a breakout of some of those same metrics that have a potential formula related to each. And some might be familiar with you and some might not. But this is where your quantitative researchers, your statisticians, your data buffs, these is where they are your best friends. Remember when I said earlier that we have a tendency to alienate potential allies? Your potential allies here are the technologists and the business analysts who live and breathe and swim in this type of work daily. They know the tables. They can probably help you find it. Partner with them. Because your next question is probably, all right, where do we get this sweet, sweet data? Well, here's the good news. Some of it exists, probably. And the challenging news is that you're probably going to have to go find it. What you need as a baseline might already be out there, but it might exist in a business format. It might be in a click-through rate. Beneath product analytics at its most base layer probably exists around the variables that might lend themselves to a combination of one of those formulas that I showed you. Why does this matter? Because if you as the designer know the insight that tells you the experience quality, and then you can articulate the specific dimensions of information that you need from a product, more than likely there is an unsung hero, a technologist, a product owner, a business analyst who is more than happy to help find it because our teams care about this as much as we do. I promise. Good product owners care about the quality of the experience. And if we can demystify it, we will find allies we did not know we had. Taking the formulas then, the next step is identifying or defining product interaction data that has the highest probability of extracting some form of measuring. The trick is then auditing your product landscape. If you work with multiple products, this becomes a little bit harder. But you want to understand what data is being captured, what's missing, and the level of effort it might take to code any of this. So, what started out as a mad game of find the needle in a burning haystack that is somehow also in space turns hopefully into a more logical approach of a gap analysis. It's kind of like archaeology, but without the epic John Williams soundtrack. You go find what you need. Here's what we need to measure efficiency. For example, you identify the gaps of what you have and what you don't have. And then you identify what you need. It's not as simple as what I'm showing on the screen. In fact, I can guarantee that it is much more complex. But it gives design leaders, especially those who are at a crucial growth point, a compass. It speaks the language of business and the business of design. It allows you to see things like, what can we measure immediately? What can we measure with a little bit of work? And what's going to take a significant amount of investment? This allows you to prioritize. And while it may seem daunting, it's actually not new. This is no different than what we have done in our field with design systems. But it's just usually we're saying things like pixels and interface and atoms instead of metrics and data. But the process is the same. In a design system, we start with our atoms, we have our molecules, we create our components, and then we have our patterns. We use these patterns to show that it doesn't have to be recreated every time. We create a reusable way to design at scale. In design quality measures, it's the same. It's just backwards. You take your design factors, you define the quality criteria, the metrics that comprise them, and then finally the data for each metric. The benefits are surprising. But let's talk, because one benefit is it can reduce the cost of usability testing. If we provide a consistent basis for understanding and comparing different usability metrics at scale, it can reduce the cost of having to test. On one of my teams, one of the researchers insisted that developers please code for, I think there were 3 metrics, time on task and throughput, and I think completion rate. Doing this reduced the lead time for us to benchmark the experience from 2 weeks down to half a day because it was there, the data was there. Second, it complements an expert-based evaluation and provides fast data. Moment in time research that is quantitative is very expensive, and researchers and designers will struggle to find large enough sample sizes to validate evaluative findings. And what if we could get massive amounts of information from the device itself? On the same team, the lead researcher was able to prove that even though the NPS was high, it was in the 40s, I believe, the usability quality was so low that it didn't make logical sense for the product team to make some of the decisions they were going to make just on NPS. The researcher was able to prove that there was an entire population of users who were not responding to the survey, but having a very bad time. 3, it lays a groundwork on clearer communication of usability between your design experts and your developers, as well as your products and your engineer, your marketers, your sales. Once the technical lead really implemented this code, there was a light bulb moment. Before, it took us a long time to find time on task. But time on task went down from 3 minutes to 60 seconds. And the developing team was able to see it without researchers having to do a study. Without researchers in the room, they were able to identify the usability variables. They were able to say, we improved the experience. And 4, one of the biggest benefits is democratizing the usability measurement practices to development, means creating a foundation of consistent measures that are part of telemetry and instrumentation. As you move from one product to the next, you have a consistent backlog of data that everyone is measuring. By focusing on this, we promote stronger usability measures among not just engineers, but among our product teams, among our business analysts, and even our stakeholders. Their background might not be in research, but they also care very, very much about the user experience. They want this information from us. They want to be able to see this. And we will be able to partner and rally with them around this information. But I want to give a caveat that usability without the context of use is meaningless. Usability as a quality attribute is really hard to define because it's so dependent on context, on the nature of the user, on the task at hand. But usability and quality have a real clear connection, and that is the context of use. Where are people using this? In a snowstorm with gloves on? It matters. But also, design without the context of humanity is useless. So here's where we're going to end today, in a reminder that this is where the data, this is where the context of what we are trying to do is most valuable, in understanding humanity. Because as humans, we want to know things. We are drawn towards numbers, but we're also lazy, myself included. And we tend to fall back and look at things that already exist instead of striking out and creating views that might be new. It is daunting and it is hard work. Measuring any of this is hard because we will have to create something new and we can't do it alone. And when it comes to quantifying that which is hard to measure, we are prone to fallacies as people. So let's learn from history. First, we measure whatever is easiest, and that's fine. That's okay. But that's where we tend to stop. NPS is a great example. It's easy, it's cheap, it works, but companies are tempted to stop there. And we know that there's so much more. But then number two, it gets dark. We then disregard that which cannot easily be measured, or we give it a random quantitative value. When companies try to measure productivity by how often someone moves a mouse, you end up with funny videos of people on the internet using fans to interact with their computers. Because if there's one thing that we know about humans is that we are incredibly creative about finding ways to outsmart systems. We cannot disregard it just because it's not easy. But then we go to blindness. We tell ourselves that if we cannot easily measure something, it must not be important. Well, employee well-being is not easy to measure, but it is important. Safety in the workplace, psychological safety is not easy to measure, but it's important. Inclusive design, equitable design is not easy to measure, but it is very important. And then finally, when all else has failed, we go to the fourth thing, where we say, if we cannot easily measure it, then it doesn't exist. And when we say that things do not exist because they are not easy to measure, we are saying that our reality is the only reality. The climate crisis is hard to measure. Global warming is hard to measure. But to say that it means that it isn't real isn't just dangerous, it is deadly. Human experience is not easy to wrap our arms around, but it exists. And I hope that what I have conveyed is a small, microscopic path forward, a first step in breaking down that which is difficult but necessary. And I want to give a bit of a trigger warning. The following talks about war. If these fallacies sound familiar, it's because they're called the McNamara fallacies. Robert McNamara was the US Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War. Being a numbers guy, he came from Ford. Body count was determined to be the metric used to understand if the US was winning. It was the easiest thing to measure, and it was a horrible mistake. Body count doesn't take into consideration the chaos, the destruction, the terror, or even public mood that happens during a war. It was just the easiest, most quantifiable thing to measure. Measures should reveal what we need to know, not what is easiest. And measures should reveal what we really need to know about design. We don't just need to know NPS. We need to know NPS and accessibility. We don't just need to know sales. We need to know sales and productivity. This reflects an internal quality that ultimately is a mirror of your design philosophy and your design strategy. It is a mirror of your team. We need to measure what is worth understanding. And worth is a balance of value over cost. Too often, we truly fail to identify value, and cost supersedes. But what are we doing as design and as design leaders if we are not building value? What are we doing if we are not creating value for our future? Thank you for going on this journey with me. I appreciate everyone's time. I hope this gives you something to consider and something to inspire. Thank you.